Good morning, and you're very welcome to this morning's Signpost webinar. The Signpost webinars are brought to you in association with Dairy Sustainability Ireland, Food Drink Ireland Skillnet, and the NRN. This morning, I'm delighted to be joined by Ger McCutcheon. Ger is a specialist pig advisor with Teagasc and based in Oak Park. Ger, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Pat.
Ger, the area of the pig sector, a very important part of the Irish agriculture sector, is an area we haven't visited before on the Signpost webinar. And I suppose the pig sector would have been in years well gone by a sector that probably had its environmental issues, a lot of which I think have been resolved, but it's still an area where there are, I suppose, significant challenges being met on a daily basis.
Yes, certainly so, Pat. I know we've had Lough Sheelin there in the past, and we're back in the 70s at that stage, but since then things have greatly improved.
We're also joined by Andy Boland to help us with questions. So, Ger, I'll get you to prepare your presentation if that's okay, and if you want to take it away.
Lovely, thank you, Pat. Now, share screen. Just bear with me 1 second. Okay, this should be at the bottom of the screen, is it, Pat?
Yeah.
I'm struggling with this. Okay, now. Why won't that do that for me? Okay, can you see my screen now?
Not yet.
Oh, gosh, okay. Sorry about this.
No, okay. So it happens.
Right. Okay, share screen. Sorry, here I am. Lovely. Now we're right. Okay, and
okay, we're seeing it in so if you hit the button at the bottom there, it should go to full screen mode.
Sorry, Pat.
Yeah, you may need to go to display settings up the top.
That's it, excuse me, yeah. Lovely.
And
now we're right. Thank you. Sorry for that delay.
Perfect. No. And thanks again.
Thank you, Pat. Yeah. Just, I suppose, Ger McCutcheon is my name. I've worked as a pig enterprise advisor for the past 30 years. And as Pat said, there were difficulties prior to my arrival in the pig development department. But I suppose the biggest issue is that, you know, I've always felt as an advisor that you can have an intensive operation or enterprise and still farm with and keep a good quality of environment and quality standards for the environment in place as well. So just I'm conscious that a good portion of our audience today will know very little about the pig sector, and for the start of it, I'd like to give just an industry overview. Then I'll talk about the value of pig slurry, and then I look at the nitrates update just on the good agricultural practice for protection of waters regulations, and a quick look at the Industrial Emissions Directive. And lastly, then I'll talk about the sustainability of pig meat production. So if I start on the first point there, the industry overview, Ireland produces, at this stage, we produce close to 4 million pigs each year. We have, and generally when we talk about pig farms and commercial pig farms, we have 230 commercial pig farms with sows. 211 of those farms are integrated farms rearing pigs from birth up to slaughter, and about 19 of those farms are breeding farms where they're rearing pigs up to maybe 18 to 35 kilos, and then they're finished off-site on specialized finishing farms. So we've about 230 units with sows in it. We could have maybe 50 to 60 finishing farms outside of that. And really the criteria for those numbers is within Teagasc, we've looked at farms that have more than 20 sows and more than 50 finisher pigs. So, you know, if we look at the number of people with a pig herd number, there could be 2,000 to 3,000 farms with a small number of pigs on them, but they're not included within these figures. From a world perspective, pork or pig meat is the most consumed meat in the world. And from that perspective, we just need to be conscious that, you know, it is an important source of protein in people's diet. In Ireland, last January, February, we had 145,000 sows. And let's say, just to preempt that by saying that that was before the start of the war in Ukraine. And our herd size now is around 130 to 135,000 sows. And we've dropped 10,000 sows because of the economic difficulties presented last year as a result of the war in Ukraine. Feed prices have gone up in the same way as food prices in shops have gone up. Feed prices have gone up, and that put huge strain on the profitability on a number of farms. So a number of farms had to depopulate their sows. Pig meat is the second largest meat produced in Ireland after beef, and we use in the region of 1.2 million tons of feed per year. Now, probably 1 million tons of grain is used, or potentially that level of grain is used, and about 200,000 tons of soya is used. Within Ireland, we have a low density of pigs when we look at other European countries. In the Netherlands, a country the size of Munster, we have probably 900,000 sows, so it's about 6 times the size of our sow herd. So we are producing about 2% of the European pig meat. So that's really just an overview of the pig sector. Historically, the pig sector is concentrated mostly in Cavan and in Cork and in Tipperary. And the real reason for that is that the pig industry developed on the basis of using the byproducts from the processing of milk. So, you know, that's why that concentration of pigs is in Cork and Cavan and Tipperary. So where you had milk processing, you generally had a number of pig farms developed alongside that, because they were using the likes of whey and skimmed milk to feed the pigs. Okay. So that's really just an overview of the Irish industry. The second area I'd like to cover is just the value of it. And this was a report that was done in 2022 by PwC. It was done in response to concerns that people had about the industry and the economic difficulties they were going through as a result of the Ukrainian war. And the sector employs 8,134 people. About 1,200 of those people are employed at farm level, and then the rest will be employed at processing level, at feed mill level, and then in the services sector and the equipment that's supplied to pig farms. In 2021, 294,000 tons of pig meat were exported from Ireland. The annual spend there in the bottom corner there was 897 million euros is the annual spend by the pig sector. And there was 932 million was the total value of pig meat exports in 2021. And that all contributes to the central figure there of 1.49 billion, which is the value, the annual value of money that the pig industry generates within the country each year. Often when we talk about the profitability of pig production, we always look at the margin over feed. And this chart just shows you from 1998 to 2022, 25 years of pig production. The margin over feed, let's say the top line here is the price received for pig meat, the middle line is the feed price, and the bottom line then is the margin over feed. And let's say I put this up to highlight that in 2022, the margin over feed was 26 cent. Now, the last time we saw 26 cent was back in 1999, but because feed prices escalated, they were never as high. The feed price in 2022 was €1.56. The pig price was 1.82 cent per kilo deadweight. So the margin over feed was 26 cent. As I said, the same price was, or the same margin over feed was achieved in 1999, but last year we also had an increase in energy costs, which greatly, let's say, added to the cost of production as well. And that's why we had such a fallout of sows from the system, and a number of pig producers, let's say, have got out of pig production as a result of the tight margins that are there. And I suppose when I talk about tight margins, you have to be conscious that the pig sector is a capital intensive operation. A lot of money is invested in buildings and in stock and obviously in feed then on an ongoing basis. And you need to be able to make sure that your production costs are not going to, let's say, exceed the price that you get for your pigs. If we look at the last 25 years and took an average margin over feed figure there, the margin over feed was 46.2 cent per kilo. And there are some years in 2021, in 2020 and 2021, there was a very good year in pig production because the margin over feed, let's say, was 66 cent in 2020. That was really because we had high values and high levels of pig meat going out to China, because China had a problem with African swine fever there. So it's not all doom and gloom, but certainly the last 12 months has probably been the most difficult time that I've seen in the pig sector. And the good news, I suppose, is that at this stage, the price that farmers are receiving is covering the cost of the feed and the other non-feed costs. So farmers are starting back making money again, but the average loss last year was in the region of about 450,000 for the average sized farmer. So it'll take them a long time before that money is recouped, but the hope would be that they will start to make inroads in that this year. So that really is just an overview of the pig sector. The second area I said I would cover is the value of pig manure. And I've always said that pig manure has a high value. And at the moment, because fertilizer prices are very high, the value of pig manure as of the start of April of this year, based on chemical fertilizer prices at the start of April this year, the value of 1,000 gallons of pig manure is €50. So that's based on the NPK content of it, and it's based on a slurry with a 4.3% dry matter. And the figures that are in the nitrates regulations are, if you have 4.3% dry matter, the NPK content is 4.2 kilos of nitrogen, 0.8 kilos of phosphorus, and 2.2 kilos of potassium. All of your P&K is available, but your nitrogen is deemed to be 50% available. So for your 4.2 kilos of nitrogen, only 2.1 kilos substitutes for a chemical fertilizer. So if we put the values, let's say the third line in that table there, the fertilizer cost per kilo of €1.97 per kilo of nitrogen, €4.16 per kilo of phosphorus, and €1.60 per kilo of potassium, the total value then is working out at €11.03 per cubic meter, or €50 per 1,000 gallons. So it is a very valuable fertilizer, and it really is only a fertilizer, or let's say a valuable fertilizer, if you're using it to substitute for chemical fertilizer. So it is important that by using pig slurry, you make sure that you get your timing right and you get the rates of usage right, but you also ensure that you're not going out topping up with chemical fertilizer that you don't require. So you're only going to get the full value out of the slurry from the by using it, let's say, to substitute directly for chemical fertilizer. And we have, let's say, in the last 3 weeks there, we've done a couple of farm demonstrations on Signpost farms that are using slurry, pig slurry on tillage ground. And the savings that are there are quite impressive. And if we get a chance at the end, we can talk about those a little bit further. In, let's say, bagged fertilizer terms, 1,000 gallons at 4.3% dry matter is the equivalent of a 50 kilo bag of 19,720. So that's, let's say, the good news story on pig slurry. Last year, pig farmers were able to sell pig slurry because fertilizer prices had gone up. They would generally work on the basis of trying to get some value for the slurry that they sell, or transport, or let's say some money to cover the transport costs of it. But if you have a pig farm near you, it is worth firstly deciding how much pig manure you can bring into your farm to use to substitute for chemical fertilizer. Decide what rate you're going to use and decide what time you're going to use it. And make sure that you are treating it in the very same way as chemical fertilizer, that you can actually use it to get value, to get its fullest value out of it. So 1,000 gallons is worth a 50 kilo bag of 19,720. That's the nice figure on that. Okay. The third area I said I'd like to talk to you today about is on the nitrates regulations. And these were updated last year on the 11th of March 2022, and they've brought in a number of new requirements that anyone using pig slurry or any other organic fertilizer on their farms, if they're importing any other organic fertilizer onto their farms, they should be aware of these changes. The first thing I'll say on the nitrates regulations is when they came in 2005, 2006, the requirement on farms was to have, on all pig farms, was to have 26 weeks storage. And at that time, let's say, the storage issue wasn't a major issue, because during the 1990s, most farmers realized that by putting in good storage on their farms, it meant that they could manage how pig manure was used from their farms a lot more effectively. So it wasn't a huge requirement, but let's say the storage requirement perhaps back in the 1970s wasn't as good. So that may be the reason that we had greater problems back then. So storage, in my view, gives you great control over what you do and how, let's say, you manage your slurry. And it's an important consideration. It hasn't been a huge issue for the pig sector because, as I said, in the 1990s, most farmers realized by putting in more storage, they had a lot less greater control of how that slurry was managed. The first issue in relation to the updated nitrate regulations is that the calculation for how much pig manure you can use or any other organic fertilizer that you may use is based on the current year's stocking rate. So the first area that you must check is, are you coming in under 170 kilos organic nitrogen for your farm? And if you are bringing in an organic fertilizer such as pig manure, you must make sure that you do not exceed that 170 kilos organic nitrogen. The second calculation that you need to check when you're doing the using an organic fertilizer such as pig manure is that the phosphorus level and the phosphorus requirements of the crop you're growing are not exceeded. So with the updated nitrates regulations, all farms with a grassland stocking rate of over 130 kilos organic nitrogen per hectare need to soil test. And all arable farms must soil test. Now, the reason that this is important is that up until last year, all of these farms were allowed assume an index 3 on their phosphorus requirements. If you don't soil test, and now the index 4 is going to be assumed if you have an organic stocking rate of over 130 kilos organic nitrogen, or if you are a tillage farm. So soil testing is important, and now you're at the point where the soil test is going to dictate the amount of phosphorus you may use for your growing crop. And let's say if you don't soil test, that default position is index 4 for phosphorus. So that's a very large change to the preceding requirements. Soil tests are valid for 4 years and should cover an area of 4 hectares. And there is an allowance to go up to 5 hectares in exceptional circumstances. So the nitrates regulations, let's say, have changed. We need to be aware of those changes. From a pig manure point of view, all pig slurry has to be spread using low emissions slurry spreading equipment. So trailing shoe, trailing hose, that type of equipment now needs to be used from the 1st of January for all pig manure. And again, that's to help reduce ammonia emissions. It's also to help increase the level of response to the nitrogen that's within the slurries that you're using. And I know at farm level, a number of pig farmers have actually said to me that since low emissions spreading techniques have come in, they're actually happier because the issue of odor after spreading is greatly reduced. So, that's telling you that you're having less emissions, but it's also telling you that you probably are getting a better nitrogen response from the slurry you're using as well. Okay, the third, just as a part of this third area, I said I'd talk a little bit about the Industrial Emissions Directive. All pig farms are required to have a license. And under let's say the Industrial Emissions Directive, which is the directive now overseeing the pig and poultry sector, the requirement is that if you have a sow unit and you exceed 750 sow places, you must apply to the EPA for an industrial emissions IED license. Or if you exceed 2,000 production pig places. Now, a production pig is defined as a pig over 30 kilos live weight. So if you have more than 2,000 production pigs on your farm, you must also apply for an industrial emissions license. And that's the rules as they apply to the pig sector. Poultry sector is also covered, but the Industrial Emissions Directive has now been reviewed, and as part of that review, a recommendation was brought back that all farms, including bovine farms that have bovine animals on it, cattle, will also have to apply for an industrial emissions license or a permit, depending on how it's resolved at the end, if they exceed 150 livestock units. So bovines have never come into the equation before, but it now looks like they're going to come into it in the future. This proposal is something that may be 4 or 5 years down the road, but it is being challenged, I know, by the farming political bodies. And the 150 livestock units, let's say, would have major impact on a lot of cattle farms and dairy farms within Ireland. This table is probably the best place to look for the livestock units. One livestock unit would include bulls, cows, and other bovine animals over 2 years, and equine animals over 6 months, right? And then bovine animals from 6 months to 2 years, let's say they account for 0.6 or equate to 0.6 livestock units. Bovine animals below 6 months equate to 0.4 of a livestock unit. So the 150 is being challenged. And let's say in the middle of March, there was a meeting about it at European ministers, European environmental minister level, and it looks like that 150 may now be up at 350 livestock units. But even if it comes in at 350 livestock units, it still will impact on a number of dairy farms and a number of cattle farms as well. So it is important to be conscious and aware of that. And I'm just alerting people, let's say, that legislation is, let's say, being reviewed and amended, let's say, at present. Okay, the fourth area that I said I would cover is the area of the sustainability of pig meat production. We know that the world population is increasing. I saw a figure there that in 1800 there was 1 billion people in the world. In 1900 there was 2 billion people, and now we're up at 8 billion and heading fast or very quickly towards 9 billion. So the carbon footprint of every process is going to be looked at very, very tightly and closely. So against that background, we said, well, what is the carbon footprint of pig meat production? I know I was in Denmark in 2012 or thereabouts, and I remember at that time seeing that they had figures for the carbon footprint for the per kilo of pig meat, and I said, that's interesting, and we do need to get into that space if we're going to help people understand that what we do is sustainable. So with that in mind, let's say Teagasc, the Pig Development Department of Teagasc, linked with Board BIA in 2016. And Board BIA then talked to the Carbon Trust in the UK because they have worked with them before in validating a number of models to assess the sustainability of farming activities. And work was done really to develop a model to assess the sustainability of Irish pig meat production. And really, we're at the point where that model is coming to completion, and we are working with farmers, let's say, or we will be working with farmers over the next 12 months to look at, well, what is the carbon footprint of their business, and per kilo of pig meat is how we're looking at that. And it's more with a view towards, first and foremost, educating ourselves, and secondly, trying to see, well, by changing certain things on the farm, how can we reduce our carbon footprint? So that's what we're looking at. In order to do that, we have to pull together a number of input items into the model. And I've just listed the items here. You have the sale weight of the animals, the pigs produced, which is on the farm over a period of time, the feed used over that same period of time, the number of sows that are on the farm, the energy and water usage, and then let's say a breakdown of the feed ingredients in the diet is required. And really, let's say when you look at the diets that we have on farms, you have the starter creep, which is fed to the very small pigs coming out of the farming house. You have a linked diet then, and these diets would be fed in small amounts to the pigs. And then when you get onto the weaner and finisher diets, they're the two more major diets fed to pigs to grow them to sale weight. Then on the sow side, you have the lactating sow and the dry sow diets. And really you look at the ingredient percentages because each of those ingredients will have a carbon footprint. And when we look at including all of these ingredients, we can see, let's say, that the soya component actually is the greatest contributor to our carbon footprint. So our source of protein is what we have to be most conscious of. And because we're bringing in a lot of soya from South America, that's the carbon miles associated with that transport and with that crop is what is contributing to our carbon footprint. So this is just a brief section of the output report. And for this farm, the emissions, let's say in kilos of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilo live weight was 5.35 for the selected farm. Okay, and the breakdown then of the red bar is the average where you're benchmarking, and the yellow bar then is the specific farm. And when we look at it, you can see that the yellow bar for feed is much, much greater than manure management, enteric methane on the farm, and energy, let's say the carbon footprint of the energy used on the farm. So the feed component is the biggest contributor to the carbon footprint. And when we look at the feed component, the soya is the largest contributor to the carbon footprint. So I suppose really what you're coming out with there is that the protein source and the carbon footprint associated with that protein source is what's contributing most to our carbon footprint within the pig production of pig meat. It's interesting, when I looked at the tillage sector, 80% of the carbon footprint from the tillage sector comes from the nitrogen usage. And we would probably say that on the protein side of the pig's diet, 80% of the carbon footprint comes from the feed components of our diet. So if we could grow more beans and use more beans in our diets, we will greatly reduce the carbon footprint of the pig meat produced. But we could also affect our feed component by improving our feed conversion efficiency as well. And if you, let's say, bear with me, within Teagasc in 2012, we had a target of producing 2 tons of pig meat from 7 tons of feed. And that really, if you look at that, that was using 3.5 tons of feed to produce 1 kilo of pig meat. In 2021, looking at the Profit Monitor figures, the average farms produced 2.549 kilos of pig meat. 2,549 kilos of pig meat from 8,815 kilos of feed. So there you have, let's say, when we had a target of 2 from 7, that was a feed conversion of 3.5:1. And in 2021, our feed conversion has improved to 3.46. So when we went back and looked at the previous number of years, and if we start in the year 2000, again, all of these figures are coming from the Teagasc Profit Monitor. Our pigs produced in the year 2000 was 21.6 pigs per sow per year. Our live weight at sale was 90.1 kilos. Our dead weight was 68.1 kilos dead weight. The kilos of pig meat per sow was 1,471 kilos. And the total feed per sow to produce that 1,471 kilos of feed was 5,385, which was a feed conversion of 3.66 kilos of feed to produce 1 kilo of pig meat. If we look at 2010, there's an improvement there, let's say, in terms of the pigs produced per sow of 23.9 kilos, 23.9 pigs produced per sow per year. The average live weight has risen to 103.6 kilos, and our dead weight has increased to 78.9 kilos. And you can see there's nearly a trend of 1 kilo extra on a dead weight basis per year. The pig meat produced now is at 1,886 kilos, and the kilos of feed required was 6,966. So here we've disimproved to a level of 3.69 kilos of feed required to produce 1 kilo of pig meat. But in the last 10, 12 years, and in 2021, let's say, when we look at it, there has been further advances in genetics. Our pigs produced per sow has gone up to 28.1 per year. The average live weight is now up at 118.4 kilos. We're producing a leaner pig the whole time. Our dead weight of pig is 90.7 kilos. Our pig meat produced per sow is 2.549 tons of pig meat, and our feed per sow is 8.815 tons of feed. So we're very, let's say, dramatically down to 3.46 kilos of feed. So in the background, I suppose really what I'm highlighting here is that good performance and let's say, especially on the feed side of things, good feed performance is going to help improve our carbon footprint over time. And there is a very definite trend over that 21-year period from 3.66 to 3.46 kilos. At 3.69 in 2010, maybe, let's say, as a result of difficulties at harvest or other issues in the industry where you have disease issues in the background. I haven't looked too closely into that, but let's say the 3.46 is a huge improvement from what was 3.66 in the year 2000. So that's really just an overview of how pig meat, let's say, production occurs in Ireland and the environmental elements that are there. From the idea of developing the model, the main reason for developing the model is to show that we are actually looking at our carbon footprint of in the pig meat production sector, and we are working towards trying to improve that on a continuous basis in order to help reduce the carbon footprint of pig meat production in the longer term. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much for your attention. and I'll gladly take any questions now.
Okay, Ger, thank you very much. A very interesting presentation. Gives us a fairly broad view. I suppose a lot of us don't get an opportunity to have a close look at the pig sector very often, and it's interesting to see the progress that's there. I remind people to use the Q&A to submit any questions. I suppose just a few things to start. When you look at sustainability, and I suppose when Board B are looking at sustainability, and there is a pig quality assurance which does incorporate a sustainability element, a number of factors will be considered. And I suppose one of the factors that's considered within that is the whole area of animal welfare. Would you just give us an idea of maybe some of the issues there that have been tackled over the last while, and some of the upcoming issues in relation to animal welfare in the pig sector? Yeah.
I suppose, Pat, the animal welfare concerns, let's say, that are coming at the sector, they cannot be ignored. Let's say the issue that would have started was the whole area of tethering sows. When I started as a young advisor, all sows were tethered in stalls, so they were very confined in the level of movement that they had. That changed in 2013. All sows had to be loose during pregnancy. So now you have an allowance whereby from 4 weeks after service, all sows must be loose during pregnancy. And that, let's say, and I know it sounds like I'm laboring this one, but the farmers, I suppose, were very wary that performance would have been negatively affected by changing from an existing system of confining sows to a loose system. And after a couple of years of the loose system, farmers realized that performance didn't drop. And in many ways, a number of farmers would have said to me, we're actually happier with that system of loose sows. So while change may have been slow in changing from that system, it certainly, the farmers would have adopted that change. And in many cases, probably the costs, when I talk about it, it's a capital intensive industry, the costs associated with those changes can be quite difficult. So the requirement, let's say, to put in extra accommodation for loose sows costs an awful lot of money. And a lot of farmers would say, okay, we're not getting a return on that from the market, but they did it because they were required to do it. There would have been grants at the time from the department to help them get over that hurdle. The changes that they made, most of them would look back and say they're actually happier now with that system than the previous system that they had. And future challenges that they will have, all pigs are to be reared with intact tails. That is a challenge. There's definitely a move towards loose farrowing accommodation, so that sows will farrow, but that maybe let's say a couple of days after they farrow, they will be loose and in loose farrowing accommodation. Again, that's a challenge to the industry, but the pig sector has always been very resilient in terms of, okay, we will deal with it. The reason, I suppose, that most farmers, and it's not that they're negative about any of these ideas, but they will look at it from a very business-like perspective and say, okay, we can do it, but the costs, let's say, have to start to yield a return to us as well. That they're never negative about doing anything, and they would be a lot more positive if they felt that the market was going to yield a stronger price if they do these things.
And I presume a level playing pitch across the industry worldwide is a key factor there.
Well, that's a very definite issue. I mean, in 2011, 2013, we converted to all loose farrowing. I would say maybe 5-6 years later, other areas of the world and large production sectors of the world would have gone towards loose dry pregnancy, loose dry sow housing. And it's not, you know, the Americans often look at us and say, okay, you can do it first, and we'll learn from your mistakes. And you know, maybe 4 or 5 years later, they will incorporate what we have done, because the pressure starts to come from there, you know, from their consumers over there. But ultimately, the welfare aspects of pig production, let's say, are something that all farmers are very conscious of. And I would say, you know, those figures that I've shown you there, Pat, of 28.1 pigs per sow per year, you won't achieve those figures if you're not, let's say, looking after your animals in a proper manner, you know, because they are quite exceptional figures. The one thing I would always have said through the years was that very good pigmen will always be, let's say, they will always look after their stock, because if they don't look after their stock, they won't get performance, right. You know. So but it is a consideration from a sustainability point of view, and it's hard to factor something like that into a model, but it's something that the industry is very conscious of and aware of.
Andy, a good few questions there.
Ger, loads of questions coming in. Some maybe you might think, well, we'll try and get through as many as we can. Okay. Is the value of pig manure based on fresh manure? What is the real value if assuming that manure gets stored for long periods of time? So, you know, is there a difference between stored manure and fresh manure when it's analysed?
Yeah, I suppose that's looking at emissions from housing and things like that. But the value is really based on taking a sample of slurry that's maybe been stored for, you know, a period of time. That'd be 10 or 12 weeks. So you will have some emissions perhaps from that already. It's based on a 4.3% dry matter. And really, I would say for any farmer that was using pig slurry, particularly on a tillage situation, but also in a grassland situation, they should start to look at, well, what is the dry matter of the slurry that they have? And it's very easy to assess that. If you take a bucket of slurry and you can buy a hydrometer for 65 euros. I did it myself last week. You can buy a hydrometer and look at the dry matter. And if you see the dry matter is 4%, you can assume that the figures that I've shown there should be reasonably right. The bag of 19,720. If the dry matter is stronger, your nitrogen may be a little bit better, but your P and K will be stronger. And then if your dry matter is lower, believe it or not, your nitrogen response will probably be good, but it may not have the same level of nitrogen. And the reason that your nitrogen response will be very good is because being more dilute, it will actually wash into the root zone of the crop, whether it's grass or tillage. It will wash into the root zone of the crop, and your nitrogen response from that slurry will be very, very strong.
We obviously have a few organic people looking in, because do you see any opportunity for beef farmers to finish pigs in straw-bedded sheds, which are free for 7 months of the year when cattle are at grass? Is that being done anywhere?
Finishing pigs on straw, I know there's 1 or 2 companies we're looking to go contract finish, and if those farmers wanted to talk to the Teagasc pig advisors, we could probably link them up with the relevant people. Okay. There may be requirements or investments, because finishing pigs on straw can be quite, you know, it's a good system, except that in the winter time, now you're probably talking about the summertime. If you're doing it in the summertime, your feed conversions will be a lot better. If you do it during the winter time, because of the cold weather and poor insulation in the buildings, your feed conversions may suffer.
Yeah, well, I presume they were talking about when the sheds were free. And another one along that line, it's an awful shame that organic farmers aren't allowed to use pig slurry. It would help both sectors enormously. And the same thing often crossed my head with derogation farmers. Now, I know there's an issue with the organic load, but you know, that's probably more
I cannot disagree with that, Andy.
Yeah, there's more of a comment than a question.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Are there any studies being done to look at how odors in pig sheds negatively impact on pig performance?
Yeah, not on odors, Andy. What we're probably looking at, we've a student who's started looking at and started a PhD program looking at ammonia emissions within pig houses, and that is, I suppose, a concern. I didn't mention it during our presentation there, but ammonia, while we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, our greenhouse gas emissions are probably low, but our ammonia emissions are probably a greater concern from an environmental point of view. And the ammonia emissions, if we reduce protein levels in our diets, we can reduce, if we reduce the protein level in our diet by 1%, we can reduce the ammonia emissions by 10 to 12%. So that can be sort of a very definite way of doing it. A lot of farmers are starting to realize, when I started as an advisor, maybe the right way to put this is, when I started as an advisor in the 1990s, farmers were buying diets based on the protein level. And if you had a 20% protein diet and a lad came in and said, oh, minus 21%, well, they automatically thought that the 21% was actually a better diet, you know. And they're realizing now, finisher diets are back at maybe 17, 18% crude protein now. But farmers realize that by overfeeding protein to their pigs, you're actually disimproving your feed performance, because let's say the pig actually has to use energy to excrete the excess protein. And from that point of view, farmers are reducing the protein in their diets, and reducing the ammonia emissions as well. The odor one is very difficult, Andy, and I'm not trying to avoid the question, but measuring odor and assessing odor and all of that becomes, let's say, a science within a science, because there are so many gases associated with odor.
I can't say I ever heard the question asked before, to be honest, Ger.
Yeah, I know.
So, Ger, just on the issue of ammonia, I suppose a number of things being done to try and reduce ammonia. I suppose one thing is in the realm of additives being added to slurries. There's initiatives there about putting blocks of or cups of trees around the farmyard to I suppose take out some of the ammonia. And I suppose the third thing is keeping areas clean where the animals are. Is there anything happening in the pig industry to take advantage of those potential areas to reduce ammonia emissions?
Yeah, well, I would say the areas that you've mentioned are valid ways of reducing odor emissions. The sector is very conscious that if you have ammonia within the house, it will actually reduce your feed performance, because it will affect the actual health of the pigs from a respiratory point of view. So by reducing protein, let's say in the diet, you are greatly reducing your ammonia emissions. From a broader context of the pig unit, the idea of trees around the unit, let's say, is a good idea, because you're now dispersing the gases from the buildings up probably to a higher level, I would expect. But the other area, I suppose, that people have to be conscious of is that if they have outside storage on the farms, they also have to be covered to reduce the emissions as well. But I within houses, Pat, and I think that, over the next number of years, anyone that wants to build new houses, in the past, where pig houses were built, they put deep tanks underneath them, and that was really to help them ensure adequate storage on the farm. There's probably a move away from that, given the requirements at a European level, to have storage away from underneath the pigs, or if, and it depends. Are feed additives, are they the answer? It'll be an interesting one over the next couple of years. I'd like to think perhaps for existing houses, are there solutions to help reduce the emissions from those houses? There may well be, and I think that that's part of what I'd like to see this PhD student look at and assess, because it is an interesting area, and it's an area that we're really just starting off on now, rather than having the true information on.
Okay. Ger, I think you've answered the next question there. It was in relation to ammonia. Have you any data or survey on the trends of mitigation of ammonia in the pig sector? So you're beginning that journey, sounds like.
We're beginning that journey, really, Andy. Without doubt, the protein component of the diets, within a house, I know quite well. Let's say there was years when I was a young advisor, you were walking around buildings, but you could feel your eyes starting to water, because the ammonia within the house was much greater. And over time, farmers have reduced the protein levels in their diets, and that has had a bearing in terms of reducing the emissions. But you can feel it yourself. Let's say walking around a pig house, you know it quite well that it is greatly improved.
Yeah. One probably pretty specific one, maybe very interesting talk. Thank you, Ger. Do you have the statistics on veterinary costs and trends as an ongoing overhead in the pig sector compared to other sectors? Any specific veterinary costs?
When we do the profit monitor analysis each year, we will work out the costs of production, and really, let's say I'm wary of saying that that's the true veterinary cost. You know, you might come out at 4 or 5 cents per kilo of pig meat. That's the healthcare cost. Okay, the reason I'm wary of taking that veterinary cost out of it is that in the past there was a high level of in-feed medication going into diets, let's say on some farms, and they may have included that in their feed costs rather than in their healthcare costs. So where you're taking a bland figure from a database, you just need to be sure that everyone is recording it accordingly. We do have some work, let's say, specifically with farms that are in the National Farm Survey, and that work would show the veterinary costs, let's say, I would feel anyway, a lot more accurately, because they will take each item and appropriate it to the various sections a lot more accurately. And there are veterinary costs there. I suppose to an extent what's happening is that the usage of antibiotics on farms has greatly reduced over the last 5-6 years. And the veterinary costs are probably increasing a little bit because farmers are using more vaccines to prevent disease rather than allow diseases, let's say, develop on their farms. So, you know, if it's a specific farmer, let's say, if somebody wants to come back to me with any information or specific questions, I'll gladly deal with them by email or otherwise.
Like other enterprises, the cost is there, but we're switching from prevention to cure.
Absolutely, Andy. You know, and let's say, so really we're switching from cure to prevention. Absolutely, yeah.
There's another question there in relation. You don't mention the slurry content of the pig slurry, which is an important nutrient for grass and arable crops. Any thoughts? Do you have any?
Sulfur, Andy.
Oh, sorry, sulfur. Sorry.
I was wondering. Yeah.
Sorry.
I haven't, because I know, let's say, you know, I've stuck to the NP and K that we can stand over, and let's say you have sulfur, you may also have zinc, copper, manganese, magnesium in pig slurry as well. You know, those nutrients are there. You know, the other area is that, particularly on tillage farms, by using pig slurry or any organic fertilizer on it, you are improving the organic the carbon loading or the carbon, let's say, you're replacing more carbon onto it, so you're improving the organic matter in the soils, you know, and that will help. We did 2 signpost demonstrations there at the end of March and in early April, in tandem with the tillage specialists, particularly John Mahan and Mark Plunkett. And really, let's say, both Mark and John would have highlighted that the soil structure, where lands are getting, in both of the signpost farms that we did the demos on, it was pig slurry they were using. But in both cases, they would say the soil structure has greatly improved, and the soil biodiversity is greatly improved by receiving pig slurry over a number of years, and that's really because the organic matter of the soil has increased, and the worm population, they said, has greatly improved as well within that soil.
Ger, in terms of I suppose structural changes or structural investment to facilitate the better use of slurry and the safer use of pig slurry, I suppose the more we learn about nitrate in particular, the more we realize that there are times of the year, particularly autumn right through to early spring, where we really need to be avoiding application of nitrogen because it's not being used. What, in your view, is necessary for us to try and maximize the ability to effectively use pig slurry?
Yeah, I think, Pat, let's say, if I go back to those 2 signpost farms, and there will be an article written in the next Today's Farm on one of them. The 2 farms were our tillage farms. The one that, let's say, that the article is written on in Today's Farm is a pig farm that has tillage ground around it. That farm has 95 hectares of tillage, and the use, let's say, historically, that farm would have used the slurry in the autumn time. So they went out, applied, let's say, 2,000 to 3,000 gallons of slurry in the autumn time per acre. They went to the demonstration last year on the other signpost farm that is using pig slurry on the growing crop. So it's winter cereals, and in springtime, they're going. Let's say that farm is using slurry to replace the chemical nitrogen on the growing crop. So the pig farmer with his tillage ground of 95 hectares this year and last year, having seen it last year, he went off and actually spread his own slurry on the growing crop and realized that he could replace the chemical fertilizer. And the replacement rate is anything from 50 to 70 kilos of chemical nitrogen that he's replacing by using slurry on a growing crop in the springtime. Now, that farm with 95 hectares is saving himself well over 20 tons of CAN per year by switching from the autumn application to the springtime application. To answer your question, what is the limiting factor there? Ultimately, the limiting factor is storage. He needs to move from 6 months storage to 12 months storage. But when he's seeing those savings on the nitrogen, he has no problem doing that. For a general tillage farmer that is considering using slurry in the springtime on winter cereals, or using it, let's say, on crops like spring barley, the main item is that they have the slurry there available when they need it. So the requirement to have slurry storage on those farms is probably what's the greatest need. And by doing that, my pig farmer, let's say, that has 6 months storage, for him to have slurry storage on tillage farms that are going to use it, he can fill those up in the winter time, have them ready so that the slurry is actually there in springtime when they need it. And so that you're not chasing up and down the road for starters with whole loads of slurry tankers. That's the first issue. The second issue I'd say there is that, you know, the umbilical system on a tillage situation in springtime does allow you to get out on land, apply appropriate levels at the right time in a quick time frame. And that's the secret in terms of getting slurry out on growing crops. We were in the Netherlands in the early 2000s, and we saw they were doing that, you know, or sorry, not in the Netherlands, in Denmark, they were doing that on a constant basis. And we need to learn from that and ultimately save ourselves money. But in saving ourselves money, we're also helping improve the carbon footprint of the tillage enterprise as well.
Okay, listen, thank you very much. Is there any other final question, Andy, or?
Well, probably one last one, Ger. I don't know if, how you are in margins, or whether you were looking a bit into the future in this one. It says, is there a minimum margin of selling price over feed cost to stay viable? It says 26 cents. Seems very loss-making.
Yeah, 26 cents. Yeah, I should have said.
The end of the question, I think, is very interesting. Are there any subsidies being considered to help farmers with sustainability? Milk processors now have programs to help farmers. What about pig processors? Yeah.
To answer the first question, the margin over feed that we've always talked about was anything from 45 to 50 cent. And that's where, let's say, I should have said that in that slide where I showed the 26 cent was the margin over feed, let's say last year and in 1999. The margin over feed, let's say last year, because energy costs went up, you could add certainly 5 cents. So you were probably up at closer to 55 cent as the margin over feed required to cover your production costs. So the second part of the question, are there subsidies there? I don't know. I think that the market ultimately is going to have to provide the return on it. So, you know, pig meat prices have gone up over the last couple of months to pig farmers. I don't know, let's say that's reflected somewhat for people in shops, but ultimately I think we do need to get to the point where the pig meat that people buy, they realize that they're buying something and they will pay a little bit more for something if they deem that it's more compliant with sustainability and other factors. And we need to highlight that, but we need to use it as part of the marketing as well.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Ger, for your presentation and for a lot of the questions. I think it's given us an insight into an area that for a lot of people is probably a little bit invisible. So thanks for that. And I think there's scope to come back again. I think it's obvious an awful lot in the sustainability of the pig sector, an awful lot of work has to be done, but there's still a journey and you and your colleagues are I suppose, an important part of that journey. So thank you very much. Next week, we'll be joined by Deirdre Ryan of Bord Bia. Deirdre is the Director of Sustainability, Quality Assurance and Origin Green. and her talk is on the Board BA sustainability strategy for Irish food. I think it should be a really interesting insight into the approach that they're taking to make sure that on an international basis, Irish food has been seen as both high quality and sustainable on an ongoing basis and on an increasing basis. So thank you very much for joining us. I'd like to say thanks to our production team of Andy Boland and Yvonne Marr, and I hope to see you all again this time next week.